Hey guys, Robert 3D Printscape. So today I'm going to cover setting up the Creality 10w Falcon laser. They have different variants as well. They have a 1.6 and a 5 watt, but I'm using the 10 in this example. We're going to go through the setup process. I'm going to show you how to get everything running and then give you my initial thoughts towards the end of the video. So make sure you stay tuned for that. I also wanted to point out that I have 4 or 5 other videos lined up for the laser, basically covering some of the differences between a 5 and 10 watt laser, some software differences, whether it makes sense to use like a honeycomb mesh if you're trying to do cutting versus just engraving, and a couple other ones. If there's any specific thing you want to see related to lasers, go to leave a comment below and I'll try to add that to my list as well. Alright, so first let's go ahead and get started with the install process, and if you guys haven't already, make sure you hit that like button and subscribe. It'll really help the channel out. Thanks. Alright guys, so here's the box that the laser comes in. We're going to open it up, take a look, see what's on inside, and then we're going to run through the install process on my Ender 3 V2, which I have right here. Alright, so let's go ahead and get started. Overall, the packaging seems pretty decent. Everything is insulated quite well, and then inside you have all the spacers and stuff so nothing gets damaged. You have your instruction manual. Here we have a better pair of goggles than the ones that came with the other laser that I have. Remember, when working with these lasers, it's extremely important that you are wearing the safety glasses. The reflection of the actual laser or looking into the laser can cause permanent damage to your eyes. Here we have just some miscellaneous accessories, the SD card and USB reader, which has some software and stuff on it, and the directions, and a spacer. We'll talk about this spacer here in a little bit, but based on whatever material you're using, it's basically like the height adjustment that you'll use on the laser, which is pretty nice. Here we have the laser itself. It is kind of heavy, but it is a pretty powerful laser, so that doesn't surprise me. The actual shield that goes in the bottom. And this is an interesting thing. So instead of just plugging this into the fan on your board like some of the lasers, this is a standalone controller. So you'll actually disconnect all of your Z-stops and stepper motors from your main board and connect into this. So it does make it difficult to go between like 3D printing and engraving, but if you're going to be doing one for a while, it's nice to switch over to it. This does have a lot of benefits. It gives you all the controls and everything in place, and you don't have to mess with the firmware or anything on your printer. So if you go back to it, everything will already be as is there, which is pretty nice. Then we have our power supply. USB-C cord, and the mounting bracket itself. So this actually mounts over the hot end, which I'll show you here in a bit, but basically mounts on the printer like this, and then the laser hangs off the bottom, so you don't actually have to disconnect anything, which is also pretty nice. Alright, so let's go ahead and get started with the install. Alright, so I'm going to try to zoom in on the printer as much as I can when going through this, just so you can see what I'm doing. So there'll be some cuts between the video, but the first thing we're going to do is go ahead and disconnect all the stepper motors and in switches. Right here we have our X-axis controls and our Z, so we go ahead and disconnect these. Now if you're running the V2 like I am here, let's go ahead and turn this, but in order to get these off, you're going to have to remove this plastic piece here, so you need an Allen wrench for that. All right, with that off, you can get to the Y stop here and just disconnect that. And then we'll get the stepper motor here. All right, now we're going to go ahead and connect everything into our controller here. Everything is labeled where they connect to, so you can see here you got Y and X and Z and so forth. So we're going to connect our Y back up. Now this can be a pain to get back underneath the stepper, but you just have to work with it. And then if you haven't worked with these wires before, just a quick reminder, the 4 goes to the stepper motors. The 3-pin out goes to your stops. Well, actually, it's 2 wires, but has 3 holes. All right, that one's in. I'm gonna go ahead and connect this one. And then I'm gonna actually mount this back in place. All right, so Y is done. Let's go ahead and turn the printer again. We'll go ahead and do X next here. All right, those are all connected. Now the one that's labeled Z will actually go to the laser itself. The reason for it is you pretty much get to a fixed height and then you adjust the laser based on whatever height you need for the material you're working with, and it stays on that, and you're really only moving the X and Y axis. Let's just go ahead and turn this around. Okay, so this is going to end up mounting on the bracket here. So what we need to do is raise this up high enough so that it can actually do that. Now we want to go and install the bracket. It's kind of a little bit weird, but it's going to go right behind the actual carriage part, between the wheels and the carriage. Just slip up, and this hook here goes under this side, and then that little screw back here, we'll go ahead and tighten this so that it stays in place. All right, once we have the mount on, we'll go ahead and attach the laser. Make sure you loosen these up so that you won't hit those when you're actually putting it on. And it will just slide on here, and you'll just tighten it up a little bit so it doesn't fall. All right, once that's in place, we can put the last cable in. So we'll go ahead and just bring this over. I recommend following the same cable management that is already with the printer, because we'll just add the zip ties to it. And with that connected, we'll go ahead and jump over to the computer. I'll show you what's on the SD card, and then we'll connect everything up. But that's everything we would do from this point. Before we do that, we can go and put the laser guard on really quick. It's just a magnetic piece that clips on. If your laser's too low, you can raise it up a little bit. Alright guys, so here's the SD card that comes with the laser. It has a quick start guide, which was the printed materials, some operation video. If you go in here, you got English and Chinese. They're actually pretty decent, so if you run into issues getting started, they'll walk you through some of the basic setup that you need. And then here's a couple sample files that they give you for the different laser powered. You can try to test with these if you want. I just don't know what size or anything they are, so I was hesitant to do that. Alright, and then you have some software here. It just gives you the manual for Lightburn, which is what I'm using. I do really like the software, but it's not free. So we'll cover a couple software options in an upcoming video as well. But for the purpose of this video, this is the one that I'm using. And then there's also some drivers here for Windows 7. I'm running Windows 11, and I didn't have to install any drivers manually. But if you do run into issues, here are the drivers. And recommended parameters. This one is very important. You're actually going to probably want to save these. So I'm going to open it really quick. So you've got the 10 watt, 5 watt, and 1.6 watt examples. It's really just the recommended power and speed for what you're trying to do, whether it be engraving or cutting. So for example, I'm running a engrave right now. It's 2mm basswood. So I have it set to 40% power max and 3000 millimeters a minute for the speed. I will make a note that that is pretty slow. It does take a while to get through some of these, but the overall quality has been pretty good. So I would recommend printing this out and keeping it around, or just always having it around if you need it. But I would start with these parameters based on what you're doing. Like, if you have to make adjustments, you can if you want to get the laser cut in a little bit deeper or whatever the case may be, but these are good starting points. All right, when you're ready to print, you have to set the print height based on the material you're using. It's a pretty easy process. I'm going to be using this 2mm basswood. So the first thing we need to do is go ahead and put our protective layer down, whether it be an aluminum sheet like this, or if you're using like a thicker wood or whatever, just to prevent any damage underneath it. If you're just doing engraving, it's not a bigger issue, but if you're doing any type of cutting, you're going to want to make sure you have something down. And then we'll put the wood underneath it. And basically we'll take our spacer here that this came with. You want to make sure you don't lose this though. It gives you different height adjustments based on what you're trying to do. For engraving and cutting for materials 1 to 3 millimeters, we'll just go ahead and put it at the top one. So we have a couple options here. First, we can try to make the entire adjustment just by loosening the screws here and lowering this down, but I don't have that much give behind here, so I'm going to lower the Z-axis down a tad bit and then make the final adjustments that way. So I'm going to go and raise this up a little bit. Alright, so now that we're pretty close, I'm going to go ahead and lower this down and just basically let it touch and then lock it in place. And that's all there is to it. Everything else is taken care of from there. All right, let's go ahead and jump over to the computer. I'll show you how to set up Lightbeam and how to get your first print running. All right guys, now that I showed you what was on the SD card, I wanted to go ahead and walk through the software install process and show you how to get started there. Like I mentioned at the beginning of the video, I am using Lightburn for this. I do like Lightburn overall. It's pretty easy to use, but it's not free. It does come with a free trial, so you can give it a try to see if it makes sense for you. If it doesn't, there are other options, including one free one that is supported. It's just more difficult to use. I think the price is like $60, but once you're on their page, just go to download a trial and then choose whatever OS you're working with. In my case, Windows 64-bit, and then just go ahead and download that, and then just run through the install with the default settings. And then at the end, it's going to ask you to launch it, and go ahead and do that. Then once it launches, it's going to bring up this device list after you go ahead and start the trial. And so you'll want to add your printer here. I already added one, but let me show you how to go ahead and create a new one. Just go to create manually. You want to go down to GRBL, hit next. It's going to be serial or USB, because that's how it's going to be connected to the computer via USB-C. And then this would be your name, so Ender 3v2 test. And then you'll put your dimensions down here. So these are 220 by 220 or 235 by 235 if you're trying to get the full amount, but what's actually supported is 220 by 220. And then front left for your origin of the laser. And then next and finish. And then once you add that in there, you just go and click on the printer you want to use and just hit OK. And if it's connected, you'll see a OK over here. So I had it connected here a couple minutes ago, but it will just be waiting for connection. Then when it powers on, it connects pretty instantly. There is one setting that needs changed. I'll show you really quick. So go up to edit and go down to settings. And by default, this is going to be at millimeter a second. You switch it over to millimeter a minute. It's better for diode lasers. Now it does go slower, but with that, keep in mind that the speed that you're setting is in millimeters a minute, not a second. So the laser by default on the recommended settings does go pretty slow. Engraving takes a bit of time. I think the 150 by 150 test that I did took about an hour for engraving, which is at 3,000 millimeters a minute. And then for cutting, recommended 350 millimeters a minute. So the one test I did, which was 75 by 75, that ended up taking a little over 2 hours to complete. You can play with the speed and figure out what works best for the material and stuff. But if you're going based off the recommendations on the sheet that I just showed you, I mean, that's kind of where you're going to be at. All right, so go ahead and hit OK. Now we want to go ahead and drop the image we're going to be working with onto it. So just drag the image over, drop it in here, and then you can kind of position it where you want it to be for the bed. Here's going to be your front left, so 0, 0. And then you can adjust the size here by dragging or by going up to here and setting it. So let's just say 100 millimeters by 100. And then you can set the position again. And you can also rotate as needed as well, depending upon what you're working with and what you're trying to do. Next, for some of the settings here, just click on the image, right click, and go down to adjust image. And you can change it from, like, here's the sketch, the outside sketch, or this one I like quite a bit. It's more of like a threshold, so only the back areas are burnt in. The top is still flat with the original material. You got grayscale in here, which kind of burns it all a little bit, just different amounts based on what it is. But you can play around with the different settings. The ones I've used the most so far are threshold and sketch. So I'm going to just choose threshold and OK. And then if you go over to the right here and switch to cuts and layers, you can set your speed. So this would be 3000 for engraving, and for the basswood it would be 40% max, and then just one pass. And you would go down here, go at an auto home. Then once you auto home, I recommend doing a frame just to see where it's actually going to be cutting. It just follows the parameter of what the engraving will be on the material that you're using. Just gives you an idea of if it's going to be where you want it to be, if you're going to have any issues, or if you need to make adjustments. And then from there, you'd pretty much just go ahead and hit start, and that would kick off the job. One other thing I wanted to point out here is if you wanted to change the start from location. So by default, it's absolute, so it means it's going to start at 0, 0 and pretty much follow where it is on the grid here. But if you wanted to change it to user origin or just current position, so if you wanted to move it to a position and have it start from there, you can do that as well. I would still recommend running a frame just so you know what it's going to do, but those are pretty good options. Alright guys, so that covers everything you need to get started with your first engraving. I did want to spend a little bit of time here kind of going through my initial thoughts on the laser, and like I mentioned at the beginning of the video, I have a handful of videos lined up as well. First thing is I want to go over the quality. I was very pleased with how the engraving turned out here. Ignore the bottom part, I was messing around with some cutting and I just wanted to use the same board. But the actual quality here was really good. It's pretty detailed for what it is. It's maybe not the best image for getting the most detail, but I was pleased with how it turned out. And this is 2mm basswood. And then I was also playing around with some chipboard. It's just 2mm chipboard just on the engraving side, and that turned out pretty good as well. It turned out better on the wood than it did on here, but I wanted to test on a couple cheaper pieces of material before I started to use any of the wood, so that's what this was, just basically a couple test runs. And I did do some cutting with it as well. On the bottom of here, I was able to cut out some pieces that turned out pretty good, nice clean cuts here. I will make a note that I did use a honeycomb mesh underneath it, so the cuts are a little bit cleaner than if you just had a bare bottom underneath it, but the cutting is really good for the laser. I think overall, for being a diode laser, it's fantastic. 10 watts is going to pretty much cover everything you can think of. So if you're looking to get a laser, I would go between the 5 or 10 watt in general. I wouldn't waste my time on like the 1.6 unless you're just doing some really light engraving. But at the cost difference, I'd probably go with the 5 or 10. Now I wanted to kind of switch gears a little bit and talk about the Falcon here in general. So the first thing I noticed during the setup with the Creality Falcon versus like your standard generic lasers that plug directly into the fan board, which you can do. They do have other ones as well that can plug directly into the fan port on the main board, but this has a dedicated controller. Basically, it bypasses everything you have on your main board. You're connecting this directly to your stepper motors and stops, and you're connecting this to your computer to kick it off. There's some pros and cons there. First, we'll go over the pros. I mean, I like the fact that it's a completely dedicated unit. You can set it up and connect everything to your printer without having to mess with your other board or changing any settings that you might have on that. And it just works really well. The downside is it takes a little bit more time to set up, and it is more difficult to go back and forth between the two, and you don't have a screen, so you kind of have to connect this to the computer if you want to move things around. I know it has an offline print mode where you can put an SD card in here with the files at the root and go ahead and hit the button and it will kick off the engraving or cutting. But I'm not a huge fan of that by itself because you can't do any of the actual homing or adjustments and stuff like that. You're just going to be kicking it off based on what's on there and hoping that it is what you're looking for. So just keep that in mind. Connecting it to a computer in today's world isn't a big deal, but having a small optional screen that can connect to this if you wanted to use it more offline would be a nice option. It's not a huge deal because most people have computers or laptops they can connect it to, but for me, it's like I had to take it downstairs and connect it to my desktop because my laptop's out of commission right now. So it was a little bit more work, but you have more control. So I mean, there's pros and cons. And then, like I said, I'll do another video going over some of the differences between a 5 and 10 watt laser and what they can do. So if you are looking to get a laser, the Creality kits are a great option. I love the dedicated controller because it gives you a lot of options to connect and use different printers as well. So like I said, I have mine connected to my Ender 3 V2 right now, but you can connect it to pretty much any of their printers that have stepper motors, or some of the dedicated frame ones that are more for CNC and engraving. This will just plug into those steppers as well. You would update the size and the software, and you'll be able to use that just the same. If you have any questions about what I covered or like to see any other videos, go ahead and leave a comment below or join us on Discord. Thanks.